The courtroom falls silent as Judge Harrison Caldwell smirks, pointing at Sergeant Evelyn Jackson's Purple Heart. Remove that theatrical prop from my courtroom. Livestream viewers gasp as the 62-year-old black veteran straightens her spine, replies "No, sir," and changes American military history forever. Before we dive into this incredible story of courage and justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe in standing up for what's right. What would you have done in Sergeant Jackson's position? Let's find out how her simple act of dignity sparked a national movement. Sergeant Evelyn Eve Jackson adjusted her blazer one final time before entering the Charleston County Courthouse. At 62 years old, with salt and pepper hair cropped close to her scalp and posture that still reflected her 30 years of military service, she carried herself with quiet dignity. The property dispute with her neighbor wasn't something she had wanted to escalate to court, but after months of harassment over the shared driveway boundary, she had no choice. As Eve passed through security, the guard nodded respectfully at the Purple Heart pinned to her lapel. That small medal represented the worst day of her life in Afghanistan, when an IED had killed 3 of her squad and left her with shrapnel still embedded in her right leg. The courtroom of Judge Harrison Caldwell was already buzzing with activity when Eve entered. She noticed immediately that she was one of only 2 black people in the room, the other being a young court clerk organizing papers at the front. Judge Caldwell, a 57-year-old white man with silver hair and a perpetual frown, came from one of Charleston's oldest families. His grandfather had been a judge during segregation, and rumor had it that the Caldwell judicial philosophy hadn't evolved much since then. Eve took her seat at the plaintiff's table, while her neighbor, Bradley Thompson, a wealthy white real estate developer, sat across the aisle with his attorney. Eve couldn't afford legal representation, so she had prepared her case meticulously, on her own, organizing property maps, survey documents, and photographs of Thompson's recent fence installation that clearly encroached on her property. When Judge Caldwell entered, everyone stood. His eyes swept the courtroom, lingering momentarily on Eve before he took his seat. First case, Thompson versus Jackson, property dispute, the clerk announced. Eve noticed how Caldwell's demeanor immediately warmed when addressing Thompson and his lawyer. "Good morning, Counselor. Mr. Thompson, always good to see you." When Eve began presenting her evidence, Caldwell interrupted her repeatedly. "Ms. Jackson, please stick to relevant facts." "It's Sergeant Jackson, Your Honor," she corrected politely. "And this survey document is directly relevant to establishing the property line." Caldwell waved his hand dismissively. "We don't use military titles in my courtroom. Continue." Eve felt her jaw tighten but maintained her composure. She had faced worse discrimination during her early years in the Army, when black women officers were rarities. She remembered her first deployment, how the white soldiers under her command had initially refused to follow her orders until she saved their unit during an ambush. That earned her respect then, but here in Caldwell's courtroom, 3 decades of distinguished service seemed to count for nothing. Thompson's attorney presented their case with minimal interruption, making claims about traditional usage of the driveway that contradicted the property records. When Eve attempted to object, Caldwell glared at her. "You're not an attorney." "Ms. Jackson, you don't get to object." As Eve resumed her final statement, Caldwell's eyes fixed on the Purple Heart pinned to her lapel. His expression darkened. "Ms. Jackson, is that jewelry you're wearing?" Eve's hand instinctively went to the medal. "This is my Purple Heart, Your Honor. I was awarded it after being wounded in combat in Afghanistan." Caldwell leaned forward. "This is a court of law, not a military parade. Remove that theatrical prop from my courtroom." The room fell silent. Even Thompson's attorney looked uncomfortable. Eve remained perfectly still, her military training kicking in. "Sir, with all due respect, military protocol and federal law permit veterans to wear their medals on formal occasions. Court appearances qualify as such occasions." Caldwell's face flushed. "I don't care about military protocol. In my courtroom, I determine what is appropriate. Remove it now or face contempt." So Eve thought of her father, also a veteran, who had taught her that some stands were worth taking, regardless of consequence. "Your Honor, I cannot comply with that order. This medal was awarded for sacrifice in service to our country. The young. Clerk Tyler Rodriguez had quietly pulled out his phone beneath the desk and began recording the exchange. Caldwell stood now, his voice rising. "Bailiff, approach the plaintiff and remove that item." The bailiff, a heavy-set man who had been watching with visible discomfort, hesitated before moving toward Eve. Eve stood perfectly straight, her voice calm but resolute. "Sir, I mean no disrespect to this court, but I cannot willingly surrender. This medal, it represents the blood I shed and the comrades I lost. To remove it would dishonor their memory and the oath I took." The bailiff stopped, looking uncertainly between Eve and the judge. Caldwell was now visibly shaking with anger. "Ms. Jackson, you are in contempt of court. I fine you $5,000 for your insubordination and disrespect for judicial authority. This case is dismissed without prejudice." As Eve was escorted out of the courtroom, her face betrayed no emotion, though inside she was devastated. Not only had she lost her case, but the fine would wipe out most of her savings. What she didn't know was that Tyler Rodriguez had already uploaded the video to social media with the caption, "Judge orders decorated black veteran to remove Purple Heart. She refused. This is America in 2023. By the time Eve reached her modest, single-story home in North Charleston, her phone was already beginning to ring. Eve's hands trembled as she unlocked her front door, the weight of the $5,000 fine crushing down on her fixed-income budget. After 30 years of military service, her retirement allowed her a modest but dignified life. Now, because she had refused to dishonor her sacrifice, that security was threatened. Inside, she collapsed onto her sofa, massaging her right leg, where phantom pain from her old wounds flared under stress. The doorbell rang just 20 minutes later. Her daughter Amara stood on the porch, laptop in hand, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. At 38, Amara was a marketing executive for a regional firm, with her mother's same determined eyes. "Mom, have you seen what's happening online?" Eve shook her head, confused. Amara opened her laptop on the kitchen table and turned it toward her mother. The video of the courtroom confrontation already had over 200,000 views and was climbing rapidly. Comments flooded in from across the country. "This is disgraceful treatment of a hero. Judge needs to be removed immediately. My father was a Vietnam vet. This makes me sick." Eve stared at the screen in shock. "How did this get out so quickly?" Amara scrolled through the responses. "Someone in the courtroom recorded it. Mom, this is going viral. There are veterans groups organizing already." By evening, the video had reached millions. Military forums and social media groups erupted with outrage. VetStrong, the largest veterans advocacy organization in the country, issued a formal statement condemning Judge Caldwell. On television, the story was receiving national coverage. CNN featured an interview with retired General David Carter, a white man with a distinguished record, who didn't mince words. "What happened to Sergeant Jackson is an affront to every person who has served this nation. That Purple Heart represents American bloodshed in defense of the very freedoms that allow Judge Caldwell to sit on that bench." Fox News initially framed the story as a question of judicial authority versus military protocol, until a researcher discovered Eve's Republican voting record and military stance on border security. By midnight, conservative outlets had joined the chorus demanding accountability. Eve's phone rang constantly with interview requests and messages of support. Amara helped screen the calls, protecting her mother from the overwhelming attention. "Mom, you need to make a statement. People want to hear from you." Eve shook her head. "I didn't do this for attention. I just couldn't dishonor the sacrifice." The Charleston County Court Administration released a terse statement. "Judge Harrison, Caldwell has served this community with distinction for 15 years. The incident in question was a misunderstanding regarding proper courtroom decorum. The matter is being reviewed internally." This only fueled further outrage. Meanwhile, Tyler Rodriguez, the young clerk who had recorded the video, was called into the court administrator's office. "You've violated court policy by recording proceedings," the administrator said coldly. "Delete the video and issue a statement that it was taken out of context, or you're suspended without pay. Rodriguez, the son of Mexican immigrants and himself, considering military service, stood his ground. "I can't do that, sir. What I witnessed was wrong." By the next morning, Rodriguez was suspended, adding another dimension to the growing scandal. As Eve tried to process the whirlwind of events, memories of her military service flooded back. She remembered being passed over for promotion twice before finally receiving her sergeant stripes, despite having the highest qualification scores in her unit. She thought of the white male lieutenant who had questioned her combat readiness, right until she pulled him from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. She had never wanted recognition for those actions, just the opportunity to serve her country with dignity, the same dignity Judge Caldwell had tried to strip away with his demand. Local veterans began organizing a protest outside the courthouse. Hundreds of former service members of all races announced plans to wear their medals and demand Caldwell's removal. As the movement grew, anonymous sources within the courthouse leaked information to journalists about Caldwell's history. A former bailiff claimed the judge had once referred to a black veteran as another military affirmative action case. A transcriptionist reported Caldwell saying veterans wave their service around expecting special treatment. The courthouse switchboard was overwhelmed with thousands of calls demanding action against the judge. Eve sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, as Amara showed her the latest developments. "Mom, they want you to speak at the protest tomorrow." Eve shook her head. "I've always kept my head down, done my duty. I never wanted to be the center of something like this." Amara took her mother's hand. "Sometimes duty finds us when we least expect it. What happened to you is happening to others. Your stand means something." As Eve considered her daughter's words, her doorbell rang again. On her porch stood Alexander Reed, a wealthy white businessman she didn't recognize. "Sergeant Jackson," he said, extending his hand. "I served with the 3rd Infantry in Iraq. What Judge Caldwell did was disgraceful. I'd like to cover your fine and any legal expenses you incur." Eve began to refuse, but Reed continued, "This isn't charity. It's one veteran supporting another. Please allow me this honor." As Reed left, Eve realized the incident had transcended race and politics, touching something fundamental about respect and sacrifice. With Amara's encouragement, she finally agreed to speak at the protest. That night, as she carefully polished her Purple Heart, Eve made a decision. This wasn't just about her anymore. Was Judge Caldwell's demand that Sergeant Jackson remove her Purple Heart an isolated incident of poor judgment, or part of a deeper pattern of discrimination? That's the question now facing Charleston's judicial system as this controversy enters its 2nd week. If you believe Judge Caldwell should be removed from the bench immediately, comment number 1. If you think this situation is being blown out of proportion, comment number 2. Hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on this developing story. Would you have the courage to stand up like Sergeant Jackson did? Let's continue with what happened next in this extraordinary saga. Judge Harrison Caldwell wasn't accustomed to having his authority questioned, least of all by someone he considered beneath his station. The viral video had blindsided him, but he was far from defenseless. 3 days after the courtroom incident, he began activating his considerable network. His first call was to William Preston, owner of the Charleston Daily Gazette, and his former college fraternity brother. "Will, I need this situation contained. That woman is making me look like a racist when this was simply about maintaining the dignity of my courtroom." Preston, whose newspaper had initially covered the story sympathetically to Jackson, quickly changed course. The next morning's headline read, "Questions arise about veterans' service record." The article implied that Jackson's Purple Heart might not have been legitimately earned, citing unnamed military sources, questioning details of the incident in Afghanistan. The backlash was immediate. 6 members of Jackson's former unit contacted news outlets with first-hand accounts of her heroism. Master Sergeant Robert Williams, who had been present when Jackson was wounded, gave an emotional interview describing how she had continued leading their squad to safety despite significant blood loss. Anyone questioning Sergeant Jackson's Purple Heart is questioning the integrity of the entire military honors system. Williams stated firmly. Caldwell's next move was more subtle. The Charleston Historical Preservation Society, whose board included his cousin and several family friends, issued a statement claiming a comprehensive review of judicial records showed no pattern of discriminatory behavior in Caldwell's courtroom. What they didn't mention was that the review only covered the past 6 months and excluded cases where defendants represented themselves, like Jackson had. Meanwhile, Tyler Rodriguez, the suspended court clerk, had become a target himself. After providing a statement to the state's Judicial Review Board, he discovered someone had been accessing his personnel files. Anonymous calls came to his apartment at night. His landlord suddenly claimed to have received noise complaints and gave him 30 days to vacate. Rodriguez's family urged him to retract his statement and beg for his job back. But the young man remained resolute. "If I back down now, what message does that send?" he told his worried mother. "That standing up for what's right only matters until it gets difficult." The State Judicial Review Board announced they were conducting an internal investigation into the incident, but insiders noted that 3 of the 5 board members had been appointed with Caldwell's endorsement. Eve Jackson's small house had become the unlikely center of a growing movement. Veterans groups provided volunteers to screen her calls and monitor her property after she received several threatening messages. One night, Eve awoke to find her front lawn covered with small American flags, each bearing the name of a veteran. Supporting her stand, the gesture moved her to tears, reminding her of the memorial flags placed for fallen comrades. As she knelt to read some of the names, she was transported back to her childhood in 1960s Charleston, when her father, also a veteran, had been refused service at a downtown restaurant despite wearing his Army uniform. "Some people will never see past the color of your skin," he had told her. "But you stand tall anyway, because dignity isn't something anyone can take unless you surrender it." That memory strengthened her resolve as she noticed the increased police patrols on her street. Captain James Thornton, who oversaw the North Charleston precinct, was a regular golfing partner of Judge Caldwell's. The constant police presence felt less like protection and more like surveillance, with officers taking photos of visitors to her home. The controversy took another turn when Eve's neighbor Bradley Thompson, whose property dispute had started the whole affair, withdrew his complaint. In a brief statement, Thompson admitted that a court clerk had encouraged him to file the case against Jackson, suggesting, "Judge Caldwell handles these matters efficiently." The implication of judicial misconduct added fuel to an already blazing fire. Caldwell made his first public appearance since the incident on Carolina Conservative, a regional talk show with limited viewership. The host lobbed softball questions, allowing Caldwell to portray himself as a defender of courtroom standards. "Military service, while commendable, doesn't place anyone above the rules of judicial procedure," he stated confidently. What Caldwell didn't know was that a researcher had been digging into his family history. The investigation revealed that Harrison Caldwell's father, Judge Sherman Caldwell, had been a vocal opponent of military integration in the 1950s, even authoring a legal opinion supporting segregated veterans' facilities. As these connections came to light, Eve found herself becoming a reluctant symbol. She had spent her life following rules, respecting authority, and serving her country without complaint. Now at 62, she was the face of a movement challenging systemic racism in an institution she had always been taught to respect. "I never wanted this spotlight," she confided to Amara one evening as they reviewed another batch of interview requests. "But if my stand helps another veteran avoid this kind of disrespect, then perhaps this is just another form of service." Do you think Eve should continue speaking out, or would she be better off letting the lawyers handle things? Comment number 1 if you believe she should become the public face of this movement, or number 2 if you think she should protect her privacy. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next part of this incredible true story. What powerful allies might step forward to help Sergeant Jackson in her fight against judicial discrimination? Let's find out. Eve Jackson stared at the business card in her hand, turning it over as if it might reveal some hidden message. Congressional Representative Jasmine Washington was printed in simple, elegant font, along with direct contact information. The Unexpected call had come that morning, from Washington herself, not an aide. "Sergeant Jackson, what happened to you was unconscionable," the congresswoman had said. "As a black woman veteran myself, I couldn't stay silent. I'm introducing legislation to protect veterans' right to wear earned medals in all public settings, including courtrooms." Eve had been speechless momentarily, unaccustomed to such high-level attention. "Thank you, Representative Washington, but I'm just a retired sergeant who did what felt right." The congresswoman's response was immediate. "Sometimes that's exactly what changes history, Sergeant. Individual acts of courage." Now, as Eve considered the card, Amara entered with fresh coffee. "That was really Congresswoman Washington, the one who served in Iraq." Eve nodded, still processing the conversation. "She wants me to come to Washington to testify when she introduces the bill." Amara's eyes widened. "Mom, this is huge. Your stand could change policy nationwide." While Eve contemplated this unexpected development, other forces were already mobilizing. The National Veterans Association, representing over 3 million former service members, launched a formal petition demanding Judge Caldwell's removal from the bench. Within 24 hours, it had gathered over 100,000 signatures. The American Civil Liberties Union offered legal representation to both Eve and Tyler Rodriguez. The Southern Judicial Accountability Project began investigating Caldwell's past rulings for patterns of racial bias. Eve's phone rang again, this time with a call she never expected. "Sergeant Jackson, this is Martha Caldwell." The judge's wife spoke quietly, as if afraid of being overheard. "I need to speak with you in person if possible. There are things about Harrison you should know." The meeting took place at a small cafe in neighboring Mount Pleasant. Martha Caldwell, a thin woman in her early 50s with carefully styled blonde hair, appeared nervous as she slid into the booth across from Eve. "I've been married to Harrison for 28 years, she began without preamble. "What you experienced in that courtroom wasn't an isolated incident. At home, he uses language I can't repeat about minorities, especially those in positions of authority." She slid a small notebook across the table. "I've documented incidents, dates, names. I can't continue to pretend this isn't happening." Eve studied the woman carefully. "Mrs. Caldwell, why are you doing this?" Martha's eyes welled with tears. "My brother was a Marine. He died in Desert Storm. When I saw how Harrison treated your Purple Heart, something broke inside me. This unexpected alliance was just the beginning. Civil rights organizations, legal reform advocates, and military associations formed an unprecedented coalition around Eve's case. The movement for judicial equality, as it became known, transcended traditional political divisions, uniting groups that rarely found common cause. As Eve reluctantly agreed to testify before the State Judicial Committee, another bombshell dropped. A black male veteran named Marcus Johnson came forward with a nearly identical experience in Caldwell's courtroom 2 years earlier. Johnson had been ordered to remove his Navy Cross during a child custody hearing. When he refused, Caldwell had ruled against him despite overwhelming evidence in his favor. Johnson had lacked the resources to appeal, and his story had gone untold until now. "I lost time with my kids because of that man's prejudice," Johnson told reporters. "When I saw what happened to Sergeant Jackson, it was like watching my own nightmare all over again." Media investigations uncovered more troubling connections. Photos surfaced of a young Harrison Caldwell attending events hosted by known segregationist groups in the 1980s. Court records revealed a disturbing pattern. Black defendants in Caldwell's courtroom received sentences averaging 20%, longer than white defendants for identical offenses. The pressure on Amara intensified as well. Her employer, a marketing firm with significant government contracts, called her into a meeting with the CEO. "This situation with your mother is becoming problematic for our relationship with certain clients," he explained clinically. "We need you to sign this statement distancing yourself and the company from the controversy." Amara read the prepared statement, which characterized her mother's actions as regrettable insubordination toward judicial authority. Without hesitation, she placed the document back on the desk. "I respect your position, but I can't sign this." My mother stood up for her dignity and her service. I won't dishonor that. By the end of the day, Amara had been terminated for creating a hostile work environment. When she told Eve, her mother's face fell. Sweetheart, I never wanted this to affect your career. Perhaps we should back away from all this. Amara shook her head firmly. Mom, all my life you've shown me what integrity looks like. Do you remember what you told me when I wanted to quit track in high school? Because some girls said I only made the team because of affirmative action. Eve smiled slightly at the memory. I told you that sometimes running your race means ignoring the noise from the sidelines. Amara nodded. This is your race now, Mom, and I'm running right beside you. Tyler Rodriguez had also paid a price for his principles. After his eviction notice, he had moved in with his grandparents in a small apartment. But his act of conscience had caught the attention of Representative Washington's staff, who reached out to interview him about the courthouse environment under Caldwell. Rodriguez provided detailed accounts of the judge's differential treatment of minorities, including documentation he had carefully maintained over months. At a White House press briefing, a reporter asked about the Jackson case. The press secretary responded carefully. The president is aware of the situation involving Sergeant Jackson and Judge Caldwell. While respecting the independence of the judiciary, this administration believes strongly in honoring our veterans and ensuring equal treatment under the law. The Department of Justice is reviewing the matter. This non-committal statement, nonetheless, elevated the case to national significance. Eve struggled with the growing spotlight. After decades of military discipline and routine, the constant interviews and appearances drained her. She frequently woke from nightmares about Afghanistan, her PTSD symptoms resurfacing under stress. During quiet moments, she questioned whether the fight was worth the cost. A turning point came unexpectedly. James Caldwell, the judge's son and a military attorney with the Judge Advocate General's Corps, issued a public statement. As a military lawyer and the son of Judge Harrison Caldwell, I feel compelled to speak out. My father's treatment of Sergeant Jackson violated both judicial ethics and the respect due to those who have sacrificed for our nation. I stand with Sergeant Jackson and all veterans who deserve our highest respect. The family rupture made headlines nationwide. That same week, Conservative Senator Robert Phillips requested a meeting with Eve. Phillips, whose voting record showed little support for racial justice initiatives, arrived at her home without staff or press. Sergeant Jackson, he said, extending his hand, my son served under your command in Kandahar in 2009. He told me you were the finest leader he ever had. What Judge Caldwell did was wrong, and I want you to know not everything in Washington is partisan. Some things transcend politics. As Eve prepared for her testimony before the State Judicial Committee, she reflected on how her simple refusal to remove her Purple Heart had catalyzed a movement. The coalition supporting her now included veterans across the political spectrum, civil rights advocates, legal reformers, and ordinary citizens outraged by Caldwell's behavior. In her modest living room, now serving as an impromptu headquarters for the Movement for Judicial Equality, Eve carefully pressed her dress uniform. Tomorrow she would wear it, with her Purple Heart prominently displayed, as she testified about that day in Caldwell's courtroom that had changed everything. Judge Harrison Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, eyes narrowed at the television screen, where Eve Jackson was speaking to reporters on the courthouse steps. Preliminary findings indicate no clear misconduct, the news anchor reported. The State Judicial Board has determined that Judge Caldwell was within his rights to establish decorum in his courtroom. Caldwell allowed himself a thin smile. The Judicial Brotherhood had closed ranks, just as he knew they would. The system protected its own. Within hours of the announcement, his attorney filed defamation lawsuits against Eve Jackson, Tyler Rodriguez, and 3 media outlets that had covered the story extensively. The suits demanded $15 million in damages for irreparable harm to Judge Caldwell's reputation and career prospects. The legal assault was calculated to drain resources and intimidate supporters. What Caldwell hadn't anticipated was the response from Blackwell and Schmidt, one of the nation's most prestigious law firms. Sergeant Jackson, we would be honored to represent you pro bono, senior partner Victoria Schmidt told Eve during their first meeting. My father earned a Bronze Star in Vietnam. This case matters to our entire firm. As Eve's legal team prepared their defense, the digital battlefield erupted. An anonymous source leaked emails from Caldwell's private account to several news organizations. The messages contained racial slurs and derogatory comments about veterans, including one where Caldwell referred to military honors as participation trophies for grown men playing soldier. Caldwell immediately claimed the emails were obvious fabrications created by desperate opponents. His supporters pointed to metadata inconsistencies as evidence of tampering. Digital forensics experts were divided, with some suggesting the emails showed signs of manipulation, while others maintained their authenticity. The controversy intensified when Eve discovered her military records had been illegally accessed. Personal information, including her confidential medical history related to her combat injuries, appeared on fringe websites questioning her service. The violation felt like a physical assault, forcing Eve to relive the worst day of her life, as strangers picked apart the details of her trauma. "They're trying to break you, Mom," Amara said as she reported yet another hateful message on her mother's social media accounts. "They know they're losing the public opinion battle, so they're getting desperate." Eve nodded slowly, massaging her right leg where phantom pain had become nearly constant. "In combat, the heaviest fire always comes when you're closest to the objective." National opinion was indeed shifting decisively against Caldwell, but the battle had become increasingly partisan. Conservative outlets that initially supported Eve began characterizing the movement as an orchestrated attack on judicial independence. Liberal media emphasized the racial aspects of the case, sometimes at the expense of the veterans' rights concerns that had united such diverse groups. The division frustrated Eve, who had served under both Republican and Democratic commanders-in-chief with equal dedication. When her former commanding officer, Colonel Richard Blackstone, a white West Point graduate known for his strict discipline, arrived in Charleston to support her, the media narrative briefly recalibrated. "Sergeant Jackson exemplified the highest standards of military conduct under my command," Blackstone stated firmly at a press conference. "The suggestion that she would misrepresent her service or her injuries is not just false, it's contemptible." In Eve's neighborhood, the atmosphere had changed. Neighbors who had previously greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact. Local businesses where she had been a regular customer suddenly had no tables available. The isolation strategy extended to Tyler Rodriguez, whose grandparents received a notice that their lease would not be renewed, forcing them to find new housing on a fixed income. As the pressure mounted, unexpected support arrived from the military community. The Pentagon issued an unusual statement confirming the authenticity of Eve's Purple Heart citation, including previously classified details of the incident in Afghanistan. The statement noted that questioning the legitimacy of verified military honors without evidence undermines the integrity of the entire award system. Caldwell's political ambitions came to light when a local reporter uncovered his exploratory committee for a state Supreme Court run. Campaign materials, dated before the incident with Eve, emphasized his unwavering commitment to traditional values and judicial restraint. The revelation contextualized his aggressive response, suggesting the viral video had threatened not just his current position, but his larger aspirations. The Charleston Historical Society, which had initially defended Caldwell, reversed course after its board members faced intense public pressure. In a carefully worded statement, the society acknowledged a concerning pattern of disparate treatment in Caldwell's courtroom and committed to a comprehensive review of judicial conduct in the county. Caldwell's supporters organized a counter-protest outside the courthouse carrying signs reading, "Respect judicial authority and stop the witch hunt." The demonstration attracted about 200 participants, notably fewer than the thousands who had attended rallies supporting Eve. As the counter-protesters dispersed, one approached Eve as she exited a meeting with her attorneys. "You think you're so special with your medal," the man sneered. "You're destroying a good man's career for your 15 minutes of fame." Before Eve could respond, Several veterans formed a protective circle around her. "That medal means she was willing to die for your right to stand here and insult her," one said quietly. "Remember that." That evening, as Eve sorted through the day's mail, she found a letter from a young black woman named Jasmine Taylor. "Watching you stand your ground inspired me to enlist," Taylor wrote. "I always wanted to serve, but worried I wouldn't be respected. You showed me that dignity can't be taken, only surrendered. Thank you for not surrendering yours." The letter brought tears to Eve's eyes, a reminder that her stand had significance beyond her own case. The following day brought another tactical shift from Caldwell's team. They released selected transcripts from Eve's case, carefully edited, to make her responses seem confrontational. The strategy backfired when Rodriguez revealed he had maintained complete audio recordings of all proceedings in Caldwell's courtroom, a violation of policy he had committed after witnessing repeated misconduct. The full recordings provided context that the edited transcripts had deliberately obscured. As pressure mounted from multiple directions, Caldwell made a critical miscalculation. In an interview intended to humanize him, he suggested that Eve was playing the race card and questioned whether her PTSD might be affecting her perception of events. The comments drew immediate condemnation from veterans groups and mental health advocates. The American Psychiatric Association issued a statement denouncing the stigmatization of combat-related trauma. Eve's legal team amended their countersuit to include these remarks as evidence of defamation. That night, as Eve prepared for bed, Amara showed her a social media post that had gone viral. A collage of hundreds of veterans of all races wearing their service medals, with the caption, "Try to make us all take them off." The movement had grown beyond one woman's stand in a Charleston courtroom. It had become a national reckoning about respect, service, and equality before the law. Have you ever wondered what happens when decades of injustice suddenly come to light? When the system designed to protect the powerful finally cracks? As the battle between Judge Caldwell and Sergeant Jackson intensifies, shocking new evidence emerges that will change everything. If you believe our justice system needs greater accountability, comment number 1. If you think judges deserve more protection from public criticism, comment number 2. Don't forget to like and subscribe. To follow this extraordinary story to its conclusion, what would you do if you discovered evidence of systematic discrimination in your workplace? Let's see what happens when the truth about Judge Caldwell can no longer be contained. Maya Patel's fingers flew across her keyboard, cross-referencing databases with practiced efficiency. As an investigative journalist for the Washington Post, she had built her reputation on meticulous research and fearless reporting. The Jackson case had initially seemed straightforward, but as she dug deeper, disturbing patterns emerged. 6 years of data over 2,000 cases, she muttered, staring at her screen. This can't be coincidental. Patel had compiled statistics on every case in Caldwell's courtroom since his appointment. The results were damning. Black defendants received sentences averaging 35% longer than white defendants for identical offenses. Veterans of color were ruled against in civil cases at nearly triple the rate of white veterans. When plaintiffs were female veterans of color, like Eve Jackson, the disparity was even more pronounced. The Post's editors initially hesitated to publish such explosive findings without additional verification. Patel spent 3 sleepless nights refining her methodology, consulting with statistical experts to confirm her analysis was sound. When the article finally ran under the headline, "Justice by Color Statistical Analysis Reveals Pattern in Judge Caldwell's Courtroom," it sent shockwaves through the legal community. The Charleston County Bar Association called an emergency meeting. Law schools around the country incorporated the analysis into their ethics curriculums. The Department of Justice quietly launched a civil rights investigation. As Patel's findings circulated, a former clerk named Sophia Williams came forward with a personal journal documenting Caldwell's comments over her 2 years working in his courtroom. The entries were detailed and dated, recording statements Caldwell had made in chambers and during private conversations. "These black veterans all think their service makes them special," one entry quoted him saying. Another noted his comment that women like Jackson should have stayed home instead of playing soldier. Williams had maintained the journal initially to protect herself, documenting hostile workplace incidents. She had never intended it to become public, but watching Eve's struggle compelled her to act. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," Williams explained in her first interview. "Each entry in this journal represents someone who didn't receive equal justice in Judge Caldwell's courtroom." Eve's legal team made another discovery that shifted the case dramatically. In reviewing Caldwell's recusal history, they found he had presided over 3 discrimination cases against Caldwell Family Holdings, a property management company owned by his cousins. In all 3 cases, he had ruled in favor of the company, dismissing claims of racial discrimination in housing without allowing them to proceed to trial. The clear conflict of interest violated judicial ethics guidelines and suggested Caldwell had used his position to protect family financial interests. The combined weight of these revelations took a physical toll on Eve. After a particularly stressful interview, she experienced severe chest pain and collapsed at home. Amara found her mother on the kitchen floor and called an ambulance. At Charleston Memorial Hospital, doctors diagnosed Eve with stress-induced cardiac arrhythmia, a condition exacerbated by her previous combat injuries. News of Eve's hospitalization spread quickly. Veterans from across the country sent flowers, cards, and messages of support. Outside the hospital, a continuous vigil formed, with former service members standing at attention in rotating shifts. Some wore their uniforms, others simply their medals, all unified in support of a woman many had never met but whose stand resonated deeply with their own experiences. Caldwell seized the opportunity to reshape the narrative. In a prime-time interview on a national network, he portrayed himself as the victim of a cancel culture mob targeting traditional judges. "I have nothing but respect for legitimate veterans," he insisted, the qualifier undermining his message. "But our courts must maintain standards and authority. This entire controversy has been manufactured by those with political agendas." While Caldwell defended himself on television, federal investigators were quietly interviewing court employees, reviewing case records, and analyzing the statistical evidence Patel had uncovered. The investigation expanded beyond Caldwell to examine systemic issues within Charleston's judicial system. As Eve recovered in the hospital, her military unit organized a reunion to show support. Soldiers she had served with in Afghanistan, Iraq, and bases around the world converged on Charleston. Many brought their families, wanting their children to meet the woman who had become a symbol of principled resistance. The reunion provided emotional healing that medical treatments couldn't address. Surrounded by those who had shared her military experience, Eve found renewed strength for the battles still ahead. Amara's research uncovered a historical connection that gave the case another dimension. In 1958, Eve's grandfather, Wilson Jackson, had been a plaintiff in a civil rights case challenging segregated facilities for veterans. The judge who ruled against him, maintaining the separate but equal standard for veterans' services. Harrison Caldwell Sr., the current judge's grandfather. The generational echo was both eerie and revealing, suggesting how deeply entrenched the patterns of discrimination were in Charleston's judicial system. As Eve was released from the hospital, another blow landed against Caldwell. Martha Caldwell filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable moral differences and requesting an expedited process. In her filing, publicly available through court records, she stated she could no longer in good conscience remain married to someone whose values fundamentally contradict my own beliefs about human dignity and equality. The personal rejection from his wife of nearly 3 decades shattered Caldwell's carefully constructed image as a defender of traditional values. His supporters began distancing themselves, sensing the shifting winds. The State Judicial Review Board, which had initially cleared Caldwell of misconduct, faced growing scrutiny. When the board's preliminary findings were contradicted by mounting evidence, one member, Judge Teresa Collins, resigned in protest. "I can no longer participate in what has become a whitewash of serious ethical violations," her resignation letter stated. Collins released internal communications showing how thoroughly the board had dismissed evidence against Caldwell before completing its investigation. Public opinion, initially divided along political lines, consolidated against Caldwell as the full pattern of his conduct emerged. Conservative legal scholars who had defended judicial discretion now acknowledged that Caldwell had abused his authority. Civil rights advocates who had focused on the racial aspects of the case expanded their critique to include his treatment of veterans and women. The converging perspectives created an unusually unified call for accountability. Eve, still recovering, but determined to use her platform constructively, began highlighting other cases of discrimination against veterans of color. "This was never just about me or my Purple Heart," she explained in her first interview after leaving the hospital. "This is about ensuring that those who serve our country receive the respect and equal treatment they've earned, regardless of their race, gender, or background." In Washington, Representative Jasmine Washington's bill protecting veterans' right to wear earned medals in all public settings, including courtrooms, gained strong bipartisan support. The Military Honors Respect Act moved quickly through committee to approach a full vote, a rare example of legislative efficiency in a typically gridlocked Congress. What began with one woman's quiet refusal to remove her Purple Heart had evolved into a national movement for judicial accountability and veterans' rights. As Eve prepared for the formal hearing that would determine Caldwell's future on the bench, she reflected on how her military training had prepared her for this unexpected battle. In both arenas, the core principles were the same: stand your ground, protect your integrity, and never leave a comrade behind. Do you think the growing evidence against Judge Caldwell will be enough to remove him from the bench, or will the system protect one of its own? Comment number 1, if you believe justice will prevail, or number 2, if you think powerful people always escape consequences. Like and subscribe to see the dramatic hearing unfold in our next segment. What testimony will Eve give when she finally faces Judge Caldwell in the formal review? The answer might surprise you. The State Judicial Conference Center in Columbia, South Carolina, had never seen security measures this extensive. Metal detectors, bomb-sniffing dogs, and state troopers created a gauntlet that attendees had to navigate before entering the main hearing room. News vans lined the surrounding streets. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting the proceedings to a nation that had become invested in the outcome. Inside the wood-paneled hearing room, Eve Jackson sat perfectly straight at the witness table, her Purple Heart gleaming against her precisely pressed dress uniform. Despite her recent health scare, she projected the same quiet dignity that had defined her through 30 years of military service. Her attorney, Victoria Schmidt, reviewed notes beside her, occasionally leaning over to whisper clarifications. Across the room, Judge Harrison Caldwell presented a study in controlled tension, his expensive suit and carefully arranged silver. Hair couldn't mask the tight set of his jaw or the constant tapping of his fingers on the defense table. Flanking him were 3 attorneys from Winston & Marsh, a firm known for defending powerful clients in career-threatening proceedings. The 5 members of the expanded Judicial Review Board entered solemnly, their faces betraying nothing of their predispositions. After the recusal of 2 original members due to conflicts of interest, the governor had appointed replacements, creating a panel that included judges from different backgrounds and political affiliations. The board chair, Justice Eleanor Ramirez, a respected appellate judge with 20 years on the bench, called the hearing to order. These proceedings will determine whether Judge Harrison Caldwell violated judicial ethics in his treatment of Sergeant Evelyn Jackson and in other matters that have come to light during investigation. This is not a criminal trial, but a review of judicial conduct pursuant to the state standards for those entrusted with administering justice. Eve was called first, rising with the straight-backed posture ingrained through decades of military discipline. After being sworn in, she recounted the events in Caldwell's courtroom with precise detail, neither embellishing nor minimizing what had occurred. When Judge Caldwell ordered me to remove my Purple Heart, I felt as though he was asking me to dishonor not just my own service, but the sacrifice of those who didn't come home, she testified, her voice steady. I meant no disrespect to the court, but some principles cannot be compromised even under threat of punishment. During cross-examination, Caldwell's lead attorney, Martin Winston, attempted to portray Eve as confrontational. Isn't it true, Ms. Jackson, That you deliberately wore that medal to court knowing it would attract attention. Eve's response was measured. Sir, I have worn my Purple Heart to every formal occasion since receiving it, including my daughter's college graduation, church services, and my retirement ceremony. It represents the highest cost of service. I didn't wear it to attract attention, but because it is part of who I am. Tyler Rodriguez testified next, describing the atmosphere in Caldwell's courtroom during his 2 years as a clerk. There was a clear pattern in how different people were treated, he stated. White attorneys received deference, while black attorneys, especially women, faced constant interruptions and skepticism. Veterans of color were treated with particular disdain, as if their service was somehow less valuable. Winston's cross-examination of Rodriguez was aggressive, suggesting his recording violated court policy and showed premeditated intent to damage Caldwell. You deliberately set out to create a scandal, didn't you, Mr. Rodriguez? Rodriguez remained composed. No, sir. I recorded because I had witnessed similar incidents before and knew no one would believe it without evidence. I couldn't stand by and watch injustice without acting. As the hearing progressed through expert witnesses and statistical analyses, the packed gallery remained silent, absorbing the methodical presentation of evidence. Veterans of all races filled many seats, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, with only their service medals indicating their military background. Their collective presence created an unmistakable message about the significance of the proceedings. Shortly after lunch recess, a surprise witness was announced, Judge Michael Thornton, retired from the Fourth Circuit and widely respected across the political spectrum, entered slowly, his 80 years evident in his careful gait. What made his appearance extraordinary was his relationship to Caldwell. Thornton had been Caldwell's mentor and had recommended him for his first judicial appointment. I appear today with great reluctance and sadness, Thornton began. Harrison, Caldwell was one of my most promising protégés. I believed in his potential to administer justice with wisdom and impartiality. Thornton paused, visibly pained by what he had to say next. However, I cannot remain silent about patterns of behavior I have observed over the years. On multiple occasions, I counseled Judge Caldwell about his differential treatment of minorities in his courtroom. I had hoped these were unconscious, biases that awareness would correct. I was wrong. The testimony sent visible shockwaves through the room. Caldwell's face flushed deep red, his eyes fixed on his former mentor in disbelief. When Thornton described specific incidents he had witnessed, including Caldwell referring to a black female attorney as that affirmative action lawyer, Caldwell suddenly stood. This is absurd. Michael, you're playing right into their hands. This is nothing but the race card being played by people who don't respect judicial authority. The outburst hung in the air for a long moment before Justice Ramirez called for order. Judge Caldwell, you will have your opportunity to testify. Until then, please control yourself or you will be removed from these proceedings. When Caldwell finally took the stand, his testimony alternated between indignation and attempts at dignified explanation. The medal was inappropriate jewelry for a courtroom setting. This had nothing to do with Sergeant Jackson's race or gender, but everything to do with maintaining the decorum essential to judicial proceedings. During cross-examination, Schmidt methodically led Caldwell through a series of questions about his past rulings, highlighting statistical disparities in his treatment of different demographic groups. Increasingly defensive, Caldwell attributed the patterns to different circumstances in each case and factors not apparent in statistical analysis. The most damaging moment came when Schmidt presented evidence that Caldwell had never once asked a white male veteran to remove service medals in his courtroom, despite several documented instances of their presence. So, your concern for decorum seems to apply selectively, doesn't it, Judge Caldwell? As the hearing entered its final phase, a written statement from Martha Caldwell was entered into evidence. Her testimony detailed years of private comments Caldwell had made about minorities, women in authority positions, and veterans of color. Harrison frequently expressed the view that military service by minorities was easier because of lowered standards, the statement read. He particularly resented black female officers, whom he considered doubly unqualified for leadership. The board appeared divided as the hearing concluded, with 2 members asking questions that suggested sympathy for arguments about judicial discretion, while 3 others focused on the pattern of disparate treatment. Justice Ramirez called Eve back for a final statement before deliberations began. "Sergeant Jackson, is there anything else you wish the board to consider?" Eve stood one last time, her bearing reflecting the weight of responsibility she felt. "I want to be clear that this has never been about me personally seeking retribution against Judge Caldwell. This is about a principle that transcends both of us, that justice must be truly blind to race, gender, and background. When I was wounded earning this Purple Heart, I wasn't bleeding black blood. I was bleeding American blood, the same as every other service member who has sacrificed for this country." She touched the medal briefly before continuing, "I don't expect special treatment because of my service. I expect equal treatment despite the color of my skin. That's all any of us are. Asking for not advantage, just equality. Not special rights, just human dignity." As Eve concluded, the room remained silent for several heartbeats before Justice Ramirez thanked her. "The board will deliberate and announce our decision within 48 hours. These proceedings are adjourned." Outside the hearing room, veterans formed a corridor of honor as Eve exited. Each stood at attention, saluting as she passed. The spontaneous tribute brought tears to her eyes for the first time during the entire ordeal. As television cameras captured the moment, Americans across the country witnessed not just the conclusion of a hearing, but a powerful statement about respect, service, and the ongoing struggle for equal justice. The email from Justice Ramirez arrived at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 days after the hearing concluded. Eve sat at her kitchen table, Amara beside her, as they opened the attachment containing the board's decision. After careful consideration of testimony and evidence presented, the Judicial Review Board finds that Judge Harrison Caldwell violated judicial ethics standards in his treatment of Sergeant Evelyn Jackson. Eve read aloud, her voice steady, until she reached the disciplinary action. "The board recommends a formal reprimand and mandatory sensitivity training." She stopped, disappointment evident in her expression. Amara read over her shoulder, her face darkening. A reprimand, after everything that was revealed. The decision indicated a deeply divided board, with 3 members voting for reprimand and 2 dissenting, arguing for Caldwell's removal from the bench. The majority cited concerns about judicial independence and the potential chilling effect of removing a judge for a single incident, despite acknowledging the evidence of broader patterns. When Eve's attorney called an hour later, she was already fielding media inquiries. "We knew this would be an uphill battle," Schmidt said, frustration evident in her voice. "The judiciary protects its own, but this isn't over, Sergeant Jackson. Public response to this slap on the wrist will be significant." She was right. Within hours of the decision's publication, outrage spread across social media platforms and news outlets. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning the ruling as inadequate. Civil rights groups scheduled protests at courthouses nationwide. By so, Justice for Jackson began trending on Twitter, accompanied by users sharing their own experiences of discrimination in the legal system. In Washington, Representative Jasmine Washington addressed the decision on the House floor. "This ruling demonstrates precisely why legislative action is necessary. When systems fail to police themselves, elected representatives must act on behalf of the people." Her Military Honors Respect Act had passed the House with bipartisan support and moved to the Senate with momentum unusual for the typically gridlocked chamber. Charleston erupted in peaceful but determined protests. Thousands gathered outside the county courthouse, many wearing military medals or ribbons in solidarity with Eve. The diverse crowd included veterans of all ages, races, and political affiliations, united by a common sense of injustice. Governor Richard Lawson, initially reluctant to involve himself in a judicial matter, faced mounting pressure to take action. A conservative Republican with strong military support in his base, Lawson found himself in a political bind. After 48 hours of deliberation, he issued an executive order, establishing a special commission to investigate judicial conduct throughout the state, with expanded authority beyond the Judicial Review Board's limited scope. While respecting The separation of powers. My administration cannot ignore serious questions about equal treatment under the law, Lawson's statement read. This commission will conduct a thorough, independent investigation of judicial conduct patterns and recommend comprehensive reforms. Judge Caldwell initially projected confidence following the board's decision, telling supporters the ruling vindicated him. At an exclusive dinner at the Charleston Club, surrounded by wealthy allies, he raised a toast to the triumph of judicial independence over mob justice. Unknown to Caldwell, a server at the club was a military veteran whose brother had served with Eve in Afghanistan. The server activated his phone's recording function just as Caldwell began speaking more candidly after several drinks. "Those people think they can dictate to a judge," Caldwell said, his voice slurred but distinct. "That Jackson woman and her bleeding heart supporters, playing the race card and the veteran card simultaneously, as if wearing a uniform somehow, erases what they are." He continued with racial slurs directed at Eve and two black members of the review board. The recording, uploaded to social media the following morning, spread faster than any previous development in the case. Within hours, it had been verified by audio forensics experts and picked up by national news organizations. Caldwell issued an immediate statement claiming the recording had been doctored and manipulated by opponents, but voice analysis confirmed its authenticity. The South Carolina Bar Association, which had remained notably silent throughout the controversy, finally broke its institutional reticence. The organization's ethics committee voted unanimously to launch an investigation into Caldwell's conduct, the first step toward potential disbarment. Simultaneously, 15 judges from across the state signed an open letter calling for Caldwell's resignation, stating that his continued presence on the bench undermines public confidence in the impartiality and dignity of the judiciary. Caldwell remained defiant, refusing to step down and threatening legal action against those circulating the recording. His position became increasingly untenable, however, as former allies distanced themselves. The Charleston Club revoked his membership. Law firms that regularly appeared in his courtroom filed motions for his recusal in all pending cases. The State Supreme Court, exercising its administrative authority, took the extraordinary step of suspending Caldwell pending further investigation. Chief Justice Rebecca Chen cited the need to maintain public confidence in judicial proceedings as justification for the rare intervention. While legal and political forces moved against Caldwell, Eve channeled her experiences into constructive action. Using the settlement from her successful countersuit against Caldwell for defamation, she established the Jackson Veterans Justice Foundation, dedicated to providing legal resources to veterans facing discrimination. The foundation's first initiative offered scholarships to minority veterans pursuing careers in law. "Changing the system requires changing who's in the system," Eve explained at the foundation's launch event. Amara's professional fortunes reversed as her principled stand alongside her mother gained recognition. Several veteran-owned businesses approached her with job offers, culminating in her acceptance of a marketing director position with a national security consulting firm founded by former military officers. The firm's CEO made it clear that her loyalty to her mother had demonstrated exactly the values they sought in leadership. Tyler Rodriguez received similar vindication. The Columbia School of Journalism honored him with its annual Integrity and Reporting Award and offered him a full scholarship to their master's program. Mr. Rodriguez exemplifies the courage necessary to expose injustice even at great personal cost, the dean stated during the ceremony. Meanwhile, the special commission established by Governor Lawson began its work, systematically reviewing court records across the state. Its preliminary findings identified concerning patterns in multiple jurisdictions, suggesting Caldwell's behavior, while extreme, reflected broader systemic issues. The Commission's work attracted national attention as a potential model for judicial accountability. One evening, 6 months after the initial courtroom confrontation, Eve received an unexpected phone call from Washington, D.C. "Sergeant Jackson, this is President Mitchell. I've been following your case closely, and I'd like to invite you to the White House to discuss judicial reform and veterans issues. Your perspective would be invaluable, as we consider executive actions in this area. The invitation represented official recognition at the highest level of government, transforming what had begun as a personal stand into a matter of national policy. As Eve hung up the phone, she thought of her father's warning many years ago about systems being rigged against people who looked like her. "The game is fixed, Evelyn," he had told her. "But that doesn't mean you stop playing. Sometimes you have to play so well they're forced to change the rules." For the first time since that day in Caldwell's courtroom, Eve felt the full weight of what her refusal had accomplished. A simple "no, sir" had cascaded into a movement with the potential to reshape how justice was administered for generations to come. The system wasn't fixed yet, but the cracks were widening, letting in the light of accountability and change. 16 months after Sergeant Evelyn Jackson refused to remove her Purple Heart in Judge Caldwell's courtroom, President Mitchell signed the Military Honors Respect Act, now commonly known as Jackson's Law. The Rose Garden ceremony brought together an unlikely coalition: conservative veterans advocates, progressive civil rights leaders, judicial reform experts, and military families from across the country. Eve stood at the president's right hand as he used multiple pens to sign the legislation, presenting her with the first one. This law ensures that no service member will ever again be forced to choose between respecting a court and honoring their sacrifice, the president declared. Sergeant Jackson's courage reminds us that sometimes the most powerful act of patriotism is standing firm in defense of dignity. The law established clear federal protection for the right of veterans to wear authorized military decorations in all public settings, including courtrooms, and created funding for training judges on military cultural competency. But Jackson's law represented only one tangible outcome of Eve's stand. 3 months earlier, the South Carolina Supreme Court had unanimously voted to remove Judge Harrison Caldwell from the bench permanently. The decision followed a comprehensive investigation that documented decades of discriminatory conduct. Shortly thereafter, the State Bar Association completed its ethics investigation, resulting in Caldwell's disbarment. The disciplinary panel cited a persistent pattern of prejudicial conduct incompatible with the administration of justice, and statements demonstrating bias that rendered fair judgment impossible. For Caldwell, the fall was swift and complete. Martha Caldwell's divorce had been finalized on grounds of moral turpitude. His once powerful allies had abandoned him. Reporters occasionally spotted him working at Caldwell Family Holdings, the property management company his cousins owned. His judicial ambitions permanently extinguished. Meanwhile, Eve had been thrust into a national role she had never sought but embraced with characteristic dignity. The Pentagon ceremony, honoring her contributions to military justice, brought together the Joint Chiefs of Staff and hundreds of veterans. General Marcus Williams, Army Chief of Staff, presented Eve with a special commendation. "Sergeant Jackson's battlefield courage earned her the Purple Heart," Williams stated. "Her moral courage in that courtroom has earned her a place in military history." The Charleston County Courthouse underwent its own transformation. Following a unanimous vote by the County Commission, the building was renamed in honor of Judge Jonathan Rhodes, the first black jurist in the county's history. More significantly, the court system itself was changing. Judge Olivia Carter, a black female veteran and former JAG officer, now presided over the courtroom where Caldwell had once ruled. Her appointment represented the tangible results of the Governor's Judicial Reform Commission, which had recommended significant changes to the selection and accountability processes for judges statewide. Tyler Rodriguez completed his master's degree in journalism with honors and joined the investigative team at a major network. His first documentary, Equal Justice: America's Unfinished Promise, featured Eve's case alongside others, highlighting systemic discrimination in the legal system. The film won a Peabody Award and was used in law school ethics classes nationwide. Eve's foundation grew beyond her initial expectations, establishing offices in 5 states and providing legal representation to hundreds of veterans facing discrimination. The organization's data collection on disparities in the legal system became a valuable resource for researchers and policymakers, informing legislation in multiple states. Amara thrived in her new position, developing marketing campaigns, highlighting the contributions of veterans to the civilian workforce. She frequently collaborated with her mother's foundation, creating a powerful mother-daughter partnership that journalists found irresistible. Together, they appeared on magazine covers and in televised interviews, articulating a vision of justice that transcended political division. Eve's dining room table disappeared beneath thousands of letters, from veterans sharing similar experiences. A team of volunteers helped her respond to each one personally. Among the most meaningful was a message from a young black woman serving in Afghanistan. "Watching you stand your ground gave me courage during my darkest days in combat. If you could face down that judge, I could face one more patrol." 1 year after the initial incident, the American Bar Association released a nationwide study on judicial discrimination, inspired by the statistical analysis in Eve's case. The findings revealed significant disparities in judicial outcomes based on race, gender, and veteran status across multiple jurisdictions. The study led to mandatory bias training for judges and new requirements for courts to collect and publish demographic data on case outcomes. Eve finally allowed herself to process the emotional impact of her ordeal during a private retreat with military chaplains and mental health professionals who specialized in veterans' issues. After years of maintaining the stoic demeanor expected of sergeants, she acknowledged the toll the fight had taken. "I kept it together for the cause," she confided to her support group. "But some nights I still hear Caldwell's voice demanding, 'I remove my medal and I wake up fighting.'" The healing process strengthened her resolve to help others facing similar battles. On a bright spring morning 2 years after the confrontation, Eve returned to the renamed Charleston County Courthouse, now presided over by Judge Carter. The symbolism was unmistakable as Eve entered the same courtroom where she had refused to remove her Purple Heart, this time to participate in a veterans mentorship program. Seated around her were 20 young recruits preparing to enter military service, many of them young women of color who had requested specifically to meet the woman, whose stand had become legendary in military circles. "I never intended to make history that day," Eve told them, her Purple Heart gleaming in the same light that had caught Judge Caldwell's attention years earlier. "I was just trying to honor those who served alongside me. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but right here at home in classrooms and courtrooms and anywhere else, someone tries to diminish your humanity." As she spoke, Eve realized the profound truth that her quiet "no, sir" had echoed far beyond that courtroom. Statistical studies had documented a measurable decrease in judicial discrimination following the reforms sparked by her case. Law schools now included her stand-in courses on ethics and civil rights. Military training incorporated the incident when teaching recruits about the broader meaning of service and sacrifice. But perhaps most significantly, Eve Jackson had transformed from a retired sergeant trying to resolve a property dispute into a living symbol of moral courage. The Purple Heart medal that had once represented only her physical wounds now embodied a different kind of bravery, the courage to stand alone against injustice regardless of the cost. As Eve concluded her talk, and the young recruits gathered around her with questions, she noticed a small display case that had been installed near the courtroom entrance. Inside was a photograph of her confrontation with Caldwell, alongside the text of Jackson's Law. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "Justice wears no color but the truth." What do you think about Sergeant Jackson's courageous stand against discrimination? Would you have had the strength to say, "No, sir," knowing it might cost you everything? Comment below with your thoughts. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who need to hear about everyday heroes standing up for what's right. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most powerful examples of quiet courage changing an entire system. Remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with dignity and an unwavering commitment to justice. Sergeant Evelyn Jackson's story teaches us that true courage often manifests in quiet moments of principled refusal. By simply saying "no, sir" when ordered to remove her Purple Heart, she ignited a movement that transformed an entire justice system. Her stand reminds us that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered, and that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is steadfast resolve. The ripple effects of one person's integrity can extend far beyond the initial confrontation, challenging and ultimately changing entrenched systems of discrimination. Jackson's journey illustrates how institutional bias persists, not because it's invincible, but because it rarely faces direct, principled opposition. When that opposition comes, especially from someone with the moral authority of military service, the facade of legitimacy can quickly crumble. The story also highlights the importance of allies and coalition building across traditional divides. Veterans, civil rights advocates, and judicial reformers found common cause in supporting Jackson's stand, demonstrating how shared values can transcend political differences. Perhaps most importantly, Jackson's legacy reminds us that meaningful change requires both moral courage and strategic persistence. Her initial refusal was just the beginning. The systematic transformation came through sustained advocacy, legal challenges, and policy reform. Sometimes the bravest battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in courtrooms, meeting rooms, and public spaces where our shared ideals of justice are either upheld or betrayed. What would you do if faced with the choice between standing up for your dignity or avoiding conflict? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had the courage to speak up? Sergeant Jackson's story reminds us that one person's principled stand can change an entire system. Share a time when you or someone you know stood against injustice in the comments below. If this story of courage in the face of racism moved you, please hit that like button to help others find it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs inspiration to stand firm in their own battles against discrimination. Thank you for joining our community that believes in justice, dignity, and the power of saying no to wrong, even when it costs us something. Remember, change begins with courage. Your courage might inspire the next movement for justice.